How's it going, folks? I hope we're all keeping well, and you're very welcome to part one of our lesson on the Vietnam War. Okay, so when we talk about the Vietnam War, we're focusing in on the war in Vietnam between American forces and North Vietnamese Communist forces. Okay, and it's important to understand why America got involved in Vietnam. Okay, well, the North Vietnam forces were communist, and Americans really did not like communism. They saw communism as a big threat. Okay, in particular in Southeast Asia. America had political allies, military allies, with also commercial and economic interests in Southeast Asia that they felt they wanted to protect, okay? And America believed very much in what was called the domino theory. So if we look at a picture on the top left of our slide, we have all the countries in Southeast Asia, and on the left-hand side we can see communism coming in, pushing Korea, Vietnam over, okay? And America believed that if they stopped communism from taking over Vietnam, that it would stop communism spreading to the other Southeast Asian countries such as Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. Okay, so this is the domino theory that America very much so believed in. Okay, now to get an understanding as to how communism got there in the first place and how Vietnam was divided into North and South Vietnam, we have to look back a couple of decades. Okay, and we look back in particular before World War II. So before World War II, Vietnam was a French colony. What does this mean, guys? This means that Vietnam was controlled and colonized by the French. And that goes back to kind of to junior cert history, the age of explorations, okay, when European explorers went down to South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and, colonized and took over countries, okay? So Vietnam was a French colony. Now, in World War II, Vietnam was invaded and taken over by Japanese, and the Japanese basically kicked the French out of Vietnam, okay? Now, naturally enough, the Vietnamese did not like the fact that the Japanese were occupying their country. So, an anti-Japanese Vietnamese resistance movement formed, okay? And these are called the Viet Minh, and these were led by a guy called Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh happened to be a communist, okay? And when World War II ended, the Viet Minh, so the North Vietnamese communists, controlled the north of the country. But they wanted to make an independent Vietnam. They wanted a Vietnam that was independent of Japanese or French rule, and there was no north and south. It was just one whole independent Vietnam, okay? Bit like Ireland, wanting to full 30th County Republic of Ireland, okay? However, after World War II, who wanted to come back? The French, okay? Remember, the French fought on the Allied side. The Allies were victorious in World War II, so they very much had a say in world affairs. And the French said, we're going to come back and, retake what was ours before the war, and that was Vietnam, okay? Now, naturally enough, who didn't like this? The North Vietnamese. So this new North Vietnamese army called the Viet Minh, who were communist and led by Ho Chi Minh, okay? These were willing to resist French rule. So they fought a war, okay? And America began to America began to worry that these communists were going to take over South Vietnam, and communism would start to dominate Southeast Asia. So what America did is America sent aid to the French troops. They sent weapons, they sent military planes and money, okay? And they helped the French try and fight off the North Vietnamese communists and also set up a non-communist government in the south, okay? And this war between the North Vietnamese communists and the French went on for years. And finally, in 1954, the French were defeated, and a peace treaty was signed. And this peace treaty recognized two parts of Vietnam: the communist North Vietnam, led by the guy Ho Chi Minh, and the non-communist South, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Okay, now the non-communist South was a democracy, like we have in Ireland. People get elected by democratic vote. Okay, and there is going to be an election in South Vietnam to elect a new leader, okay? Now, the problem with this was some of the politicians who were running in the South Vietnamese election were communists. And America did not like this. They thought, oh, Janie, what happens if a communist wins the South Vietnamese election? South Vietnam is going to become communist. So America used their power to interfere with the election and stop the South elections being held. And this meant that communists could not run in them and not win. Okay, now, Who did this annoy? This annoyed the communists, in particular Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the North's communist Vietnam, okay? And he was annoyed at this. So what did he do in response? He started a guerrilla warfare against the government in the South. Remember, guys, America was not yet in Vietnam, okay? So North Vietnamese communists started a war with the South Vietnamese non-communists in the South, and this was a guerrilla war. So this is like kind of like, you know, hit and run style warfare where North Vietnamese troops might ambush South Vietnamese troops and then run away and hide. Okay. And the South Vietnamese army was very, very bad. They were really weak, okay? So the Americans helped them by sending them money, military equipment, and advisors, okay? So if we look at the picture on the bottom right-hand side there, for example, that's a US advisor showing South Vietnamese troops how to use that weapon, okay? The South Vietnamese troops are also wearing American-style helmets. Again, these are given to them by the Americans, okay? Now, despite American help, the South Vietnamese government and the South Vietnamese army was unable to withstand Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnamese communist forces, okay? And by 1963, the South government was about to collapse after struggling against the North Vietnamese forces, who are now called the Viet Cong, okay? Now, why was the South Vietnamese regime and military so poor? There are a couple of reasons for this, okay? The Diem regime in the South was becoming more and more unpopular with the people of South Vietnam. And the main reason for this was Diem, so the South Vietnamese leader, the guy in the top right there, was a Catholic. And he very much favoured the Catholic minority. There was a small minority of Catholic people in South Vietnam that he favoured. Okay, and the majority of people in South Vietnam were in fact Buddhist, and he didn't care at all about the Buddhists. Okay, and that's a big reason why the South Vietnamese army was so bad, because all the really important jobs like colonels and generals, the guys who were leading the army, were Catholics, and they were given those jobs, those high-ranking jobs in the army, because of their religion, not because of their good military leaders. So as a result, the South Vietnamese army was led by Catholics who were, you know, not necessarily any good at their job. So as a result, this caused, you know, the military to be quite poor and inefficient. Okay. Bottom right there, guys, you can see pictures of now this is South Vietnam. South Vietnamese Buddhists rioting against the Diem's Catholic regime that they do not like, okay? So US President John F. Kennedy was convinced that this is going to become a big problem. There's almost going to be a civil war in the South. So what did he do? He had Diem killed. He gave permission for the South Vietnamese army to overthrow Diem and kill him. Okay, and what this kind of meant that there was not going to be a civil war in South Vietnam, because if there was a civil war, that posed a grave danger that communism might spread to the South. Okay, now, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, a new president called Lyndon B Johnson took over in November 1963, and Lyndon B Johnson very much felt that America had to protect its interests in South Vietnam, and he very much believed in the domino effect. Okay, so if you look at the picture there, guys, you can see there's the, you know, American Uncle Sam trying to, you know, stop the dominoes of communism falling on top of himself and, you know, spreading to Cambodia and Laos. Okay, and as a result of this, American involvement in Vietnam was about to get much, much bigger and escalate even further. Okay, so up until this stage, guys, all America had done was provide weapons to the South Vietnamese and assistance. Now they're going to have a big military presence there. Okay. Now, to literally invade Vietnam, the Americans needed to have a justifiable reason for doing so. Okay, and there was no real justifiable reason yet. Okay, fair enough, communism was going to spread. Okay, but America felt that, okay, for us to get support for going to Vietnam, we have to have a reason. So the Gulf of Tonkin incident proved to be the perfect reason to get involved in Vietnam. So on August 2nd, 1964, the US claimed that North Vietnamese communist gunboats attacked 2 US ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin is an area just off the east coast of Vietnam. If you look at the picture in the bottom left, guys, that's a picture of an American politician kind of, you know, showing on a board what had happened. Okay, now the thing about this is the Gulf of Tonkin incident, so the so-called incident where North Vietnamese communists attacked US warships, was fabricated. It was made up. okay? And it was made up by the US government because it gave them a proper, justifiable reason for going into Vietnam, for putting American troops in Vietnam, okay? A few days later, so 5 days later, on August the 7th, 1964, the US Senate passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And what did this mean? This meant that America could now take any necessary steps to defend the US and its allies. And most Americans supported this decision, okay? So to take any necessary steps, guys, that means basically, in this case, go to war. We will invade Vietnam and try to stop the North Vietnamese communists ourselves. And that's exactly what happened. Okay, so in 1965, American troop numbers and American kind of military numbers grew and grew and grew in Vietnam. Okay, the reason why this was is because, again, the South Vietnamese army was useless. They could not fight the North Vietnamese communists. So America were so afraid that they said, look, we're going to have to go in there ourselves. And hence that's why this idea of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, okay, making up an incident that, you know, means you can now, it justifies your reasoning for invading Vietnam, okay? In February 1965, Lyndon B Johnson orders Operation Rolling Thunder, and this is a US-led bombing campaign against the North Vietnamese, okay? There's a top left there, a US bomber, a B-59 bomber dropping a huge amount of bombs. And like the North Vietnamese communists didn't really have equipment such as this, okay? The American army was seen as, like, you know, a modern, really, really powerful army. And you know, going into this war, Americans believed that, you know, they would defeat the North Vietnamese within a matter of months, okay? But that really turned out not to be the case, okay? So this bombing campaign, Operation Rolling Thunder, was meant to end after 8 weeks, but it ended up lasting for 3 years. Okay, such was the stalemate in Vietnam, such was the problem that Americans had fighting the North Vietnamese communist forces, that they ended up staying there for a long, long time. Okay, in March 1965, US General Westmoreland asked for more and more ground troops. And a year later, by 1966, there were 500,000 US troops in Vietnam, and all in all, 2.7 million US troops served in Vietnam. So almost half the population of Ireland worth of soldiers served in Vietnam. Okay, so, you know, America committed absolutely huge military resources to this war. Okay, now, this is going to be our final slide on this part, guys, okay? And part 2, you'll see, it'll be the next video, okay? So, guerrilla warfare. What was it like for an American soldier in Vietnam fighting? Well, it was not very nice at all, okay? So, the North Vietnamese communists, or the Viet Cong, were expert guerrilla fighters, and the Americans had no answer for this type of warfare. When I say guerrilla fighters, what do I mean? Well, if you look at the picture there in the bottom left, you can see this is a typical kind of tunnel system the North Vietnamese had around Vietnam. Okay, so what they do is they'd pop up out of the ground, they would ambush American forces, and then they would retreat back into their underground system and network of tunnels. Okay, and the Americans had no answer to this. Like, no amount of bombs could, stop an underground tunnel system full of troops who were highly trained in using this type of warfare. Okay, like, most American soldiers never even saw a Viet Cong North Vietnamese soldier, because they'd be, fired upon from the bushes or from the forest or from the rainforest, and then they'd be gone. Okay, the Viet Cong would lay ambushes, lay booby traps, and launch surprise attacks from the jungle. Okay, as I've already said, after attacking, the North Viet Cong communist troops would retreat back into this underground system of tunnels, and it'd be very impossible to root out. Okay, as a result, many innocent civilians were actually also killed in this. Why? Because a lot of North Vietnamese troops didn't wear uniforms. They just wore civilian clothing, so they could surprise the Americans. They could jump out anywhere, okay, and Americans wouldn't know if they were civilians or they were troops. So Americans couldn't see their enemy really until they were literally being fired at. Okay, and as a result of this, a lot of innocent Vietnamese civilians were killed because they were caught up in the crossfire. Okay, and they're the ones who suffered the most. The Vietnamese civilians really bore the brunt of this campaign. Okay, folks, thanks so much for watching part 1. Make sure to tune into part 2.